welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. We're all set up in the new recording studio / office / office. Double offices because I do multiple jobs in here. And we're ready to go. I have had surgery. You might notice a mild weakness in my voice for a while. I hope you bear with me. Okay. We are talking about Isaac Deutscher's 1950 essay, The Ex-Communist Conscience. Now, I've talked a lot about the many communist reactionary pipelines. There's the much over-extenuated Trotskyist to neocon. There's the Marxist-Leninist to diehard ex-communist a la Whittaker Chambers. There's the ultra-leftist to ultra-nationalist, like the guy who wrote Militancy, the Highest Stage of Alienation. There is the myriad of ways in which French Maoists went into rightward political directions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s after Mao Spondex in the 60s. And I bring all that up because I think there's a kind of almost idealist way of viewing the many ways in which people become ex-communists and even reactionaries, as if there is a flaw in the ideology alone. And unfortunately, as I've talked about with Tony over at One Dime and a lot of other places, it's just not true that there's a clear singular ideological pathway to create ex-communists. But the one thing it is true is that communists have tended to meet their most vociferous and frankly most agile and sometimes smartest enemies in former communists. Now, this is something Deutscher realized himself. Deutscher was born in 1907 and died in 1967. He is kind of famous for writing scholarly biographies of both Trotsky and Stalin. In fact, his 3-volume Prophet trilogy on Trotsky is considered kind of definitive. He was a Trotskyist, and I believe he was associated with the Mandelite tendency, but I am not 100% sure on that one. He was influential on the British New Left, like a lot of, and not quite as influential on the American New Left, but he's a key figure nonetheless. Now, that's the basis of Deutscher's life. If you want to read two interesting biographies, you can read his biography of Stalin and his biography of Trotsky, although I would say they're both biased. I quite like the Trotsky one. Deutscher is also somewhat famous for being the person who came up with the distinction between classical Marxism and vulgar Marxism, which is an interesting distinction. Both vulgar Marxism and classical Marxism are associated with the orthodox Marxism of the Second International, and he sort of makes the distinction between them where those two things go. That's just a little bit of background. It's not actually relevant to this essay, which is relatively short. One thing it is relevant to this essay, though, is to remember that a lot of the Italian fascist leadership, particularly in the early days, after Mussolini left the maximalist faction of the Italian Socialist Party, were ex-socialist and ex-communist, and that's something to always keep in mind. Ignacio Salone, I think, relates that he said jokingly to Togliatti, the Italian communist leader, The final struggle will be between the communist and the ex-communist. There's a bitter drop of truth in the joke. And the propaganda skirmishes against the USSR and communism, the ex-communist and the ex-fellow traveler is the most active sharpshooter. In fact, you see this today with the ex-progressive. I used to be liberal, but I left. I didn't leave the left, but the left left me. Long ways this has happened. But the ex-communist is sort of the or form of this in the 20th century, and something we still deal with today, although some ex-communists will not say that they're ex-communists. We'll get to that later. With the peevishness that distinguishes him from Salone, Affe Koestler made a similar point. Also, Koestler himself was an ex-communist. It's the same with all you comfortable insular Anglo-Saxon anti-communists. You hate our Cassandra cries and resent us as allies, but when all is said, we ex-communists are the only people on your side who know what it's all about. And there were a whole lot of people who Koestler corralled around the ex-communist legion. The ex-communist is a problem child of contemporary politics. He crops up in the oddest places and corners. He buttonholed you in Berlin to tell the story of his Battle of Stalingrad, fought here in Berlin against Stalin. You find him in de Gaulle's entourage, none other than André Malraux, the author of Man's Estate. In America's strange political trial, the ex-communist has, for months, put his fingers at Alger Hiss. That's clearly Whittaker Chambers that Deutscher is referring to there. Another ex-communist, Ruth Fisher, denounces her brother, Erhard Eisler, and castigates the British for not handing him back to the United States. An ex-Trotskyite, James Burnham, we've talked a lot about Burnham on this channel, flays the American businessman for his real or illusionary lack of capitalist class consciousness and sketches a program of action for nothing less than the worldwide defeat of communism. And now 6 writers, Koestler, Salone, André Gide, Louis Fisher, Richard Wright, the black writer and ex-communist, and Stefan Spender get together and expose and destroy the God that failed. It's kind of a conservative classic, although interestingly, none of the people who wrote for it were conservatives. The Legion of Ex-Communists does not march in close formation. It is scattered far and wide. Its members resemble one another very much, but they also differ. They have common traits and individual features. They all left an army in a camp, some as conscientious objectors, some as deserters, others as marauders. A few still stick quietly to their conscientious objections, while others vociferously claim commissions in an army which they had bitterly opposed. All wear threadbare bits and pieces of an old uniform, supplemented by the quaintest rags, and all carry their common resentments and individual reminiscences. See David Horowitz complaining about the Black Panthers. See most of the partisan review that became Commentary Magazine and Bill Kristol's father. Although Bill Kristol himself seemingly is having the same journey, but to progressivism from neoconservatism. Life is weird. Some join the party at one time, others at another. The date of joining is relevant to their further experience. Intellectual integrity was still valued in a communist, and yet it has not been surrendered for good to Moscow's raison d'etre. Those who joined the party in the 1930s began the experience on a much lower level. Right from the beginning, they were manipulated like recruits on the party's barrack squares by the party's sergeant majors. This difference bears upon the quality of the ex-communist reminiscences. Salone, who joined the party in 1921, recalls with real warmth his first contact with it. He conveys fully the intellectual excitement and moral enthusiasm which communism pulsated in those early days. Reminiscences of Koestler and Spender, who joined in the 30s, reveal an other moral and intellectual sterility of the party's first impact on them. Salone and his comrades were intensely concerned with the fundamental ideas before and after they were absorbed into the drudgery of day-to-day duty. In Koestler's story, his party assignment, right from the first moment, overshadows all the personal conviction and ideal. The communist of the early drafts was revolutionary before he became, or was expected to become, a puppet. The communists of the later drafts hardly got a chance to breathe the genuine Arab Revolution. Nevertheless, the original motives for joining were similar, if not identical, in almost every case. Experience of social injustice or degradation, a sense of insecurity by slumps and social crises, and a craving for a great ideal or purpose are for the reliable intellectual guide through the shaky labyrinth of modern society. I think we see a lot of this today. A lot of people go to communism as a replacement for religion. Not because communism is a good religion or Marxism is religious, but a lot of people want some solid ground to rest themselves on. And they do so by often adopting vulgar forms of ideology. The newcomer felt the miseries of the old capitalist order to be unbearable, and the glowing light of the Russian Revolution illumined those miseries with extraordinary sharpness. Socialism, classless society, the withering away of the state, things that a lot of communists today don't even believe in, all seem to be around the corner. Few of the newcomers had any premonitions of the blood and sweat and tears to come. To himself, the intellectual convert to communism seemed a new Prometheus, except that he would not be pinned down to the rock by Zeus's wrath. Nothing henceforth, so Coulter now recalls in the mood in those days, can disturb the convert's inner peace and serenity, except the occasional fear of losing faith again. Our ex-communist now bitterly denounces the betrayal of his hopes. This appears to him to have almost no precedent, yet he eloquently describes his expectations and illusions. We detect a strangely familiar tone. Exactly so did the disillusioned Wordsworth and his contemporaries, looking back upon the youthful enthusiasm for the French Revolution. I mean, a lot of the British romantics, just so you know, were initially very supportive of the French Revolution, of radical bourgeois revolutionaryism. And by the end of their lives, almost all of them were reactionaries, except for like the ones that died young, like Byron, who was just a kind of decadent aristocrat anyway. And the Shelleys, except, because Percy Bysshe Shelley dies young. You can see where this is going. Bliss was it the dawn to be alive. To be young was very heaven. The intellectual communist who breaks away emotionally from his party can claim some noble ancestry. Beethoven tore to pieces the title of his Eroica, on which he dedicated the sympathy to Napoleon as soon as he learned that the first consul was about to ascend the throne. Wordsworth called the crowning of Napoleon a sad reverse for all mankind. All over Europe, the enthusiasts of the French Revolution were stunned by their discovery that the Corsican liberator of the peoples, an enemy and a tyrant, was himself a tyrant and an oppressor. And in the same way, the Wordsworth of our days were shocked at the sight of Stalin fraternizing with Hitler and Ribbentrop. This is particularly true after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. If no new eroticas were created in our days, at least the declaratory pages of unwritten sympathies have been torn with great flourishes. In The God That Failed, Louis Fisher tries to explain somewhat remorsefully and not quite convincingly why he adhered to the Stalin cult for so long. He analyzes the variety of motives, some working slowly and some rapidly, which determine the moment in which people recover from their infatuation with Stalinism. Asterisk. I don't think Stalinism is one thing. I'm not one of those people who tells you there's no such thing as Stalinism at all. Because there are Marxist-Leninism based purely off the idea of Stalin, and people are like, oh, it's just orthodox Marxism. Everyone claims that. That's not particularly meaningful. But the difference between a Marxist-Leninist who is a Soviet defensist in the 1950s, even if they have a positive view of Stalin, and a Hojaist who has a positive view of Stalin, and a Maoist who has a positive view of Stalin, they actually have very different ideologies. But anyway, this was not apparent in 1950. I mean, Stalin wasn't even dead yet. The force of the European disillusionment with Napoleon was almost equally uneven and capricious. The great Italian poet, Ugo Foscolato, who had been Napoleon's soldier and composed an ode to Bonaparte the Liberator, turned against his idol after the Peace of Campoformio, I think. This must have stunned a Jacobin from Venice as the Nazi-Soviet pact stunned a Polish communist. But a man like Beethoven remained under the spell of Bonaparte for 7 years more. until he saw the despot drop his Republican mask. This was an eye-opener compared to Stalin's purge trials in the 1930s. There is no greater tragedy than the great revolutionary succumbing to the mailed fist that was to defend it from its enemies. There can be no spectacle as disgusting as that of the post-revolutionary tyranny dressed up in the banners of liberty. The ex-communist is morally justified, as was the ex-Jacobin, in reveling and revolting in that spectacle. But is it true, as Oscar Kosler claims, that ex-communists are the only people who know what it's all about? One may risk an assertion that the exact opposite of true. Of all people, the ex-communists know the least what it is all about. Cough, cough. At any rate, the pedagogical predictions of the ex-communist men of letters seem grossly exaggerated. Some of them, Salone is a notable exception, and he's the one that's not remembered because he's kind of sincere. I've read The God That Failed. A lot of people don't know. I spent a lot of time reading a lot of anti-communist literature and scholarship, right-wing scholarship even, about anti-communist literature. And so I've always found this really funny. But anyway, that a lot of the people who are more convincing are not the people we remember. We remember the more hackneyed drips like Kosler. Have never been inside the real communist movement in the thick of its clandestine or open organization. That's often true. Actually, they're often on the outskirts. As a result, they moved on from literary or journalistic fringe of the party. See Partisan Review to Commentary Magazine. Their notions of communist doctrine and ideology usually sprung from their own literary intuition, which is sometimes acute but often misleading. Bing, bing. We might call this the intellectual's gambit. Worse still is the ex-communist characteristic and capacity for detachment. His emotional reaction against his former environment keeps him in its deadly grip and prevents him from understanding the drama in which he was involved or half involved. The picture of communism, Stalinism he draws from is that of a gigantic chamber of intellectual and moral horrors. Viewing it, the uninitiated are transferred from politics into pure demonology. Sometimes the artistic effect may be strong. Horrors and demons do enter into many a poetic masterpiece, but it is politically unreliable or even dangerous. See, trying to use George Orwell's 1984 as any moral guidance for anything. Of course, the story of Stalinism abounds in horrors. But this is only one of its elements, and even this, the demonic, has to be translated in terms of human motives and interests. The ex-communist does not attempt the translation. And I actually think we have to take a lot of these movements more sui generously instead of telling moral stories about them. I get yelled at by both anti-MLs, Leninist influenced by Trotsky or Bordiga, but also I get yelled at by MLs because I think when dealing with history and when dealing with something as ugly as either the French or the Russian Revolution, and as beautiful as either French or the Russian Revolution, one cannot pretend that it's all of one nature, that it ever could be, that it was solely progressive or regressive, or that Stalin was just, the bad dude ruining the bad motives of a bad guy. I mean, it's just not historically useful to do that. And I actually find it weird that we only tend to do it to ideologies that make us uncomfortable because we don't like the outcomes of where they went. And that's not just true for communism. I mean, people do that with all kinds of revolutions. They'll try to say they weren't revolutions because there were reactionary elements deep within them, but there's reactionary elements within every revolutionary impulse. And the rare flash of general and self-criticism, Kosler makes this admission. Quote from Kosler in one of his few lucid moments. You can tell how I feel about Oscar Kosler. As a rule, our memories romanticize the past, but when one renounces a creed or been betrayed by a friend, the opposite mechanism sets to work. In the light of that latter knowledge, the original experience loses its innocence, becomes tainted and rancid in recollection, recollection, and I have tried in these pages to recapture the mood in which the experiences in the Communist Party related were originally lived. And I know I have failed. Irony, anger, and shame kept intruding. The passion of that time transformed into perversions, its inner certitude in an enclosed universe of a drug addict, which I've seen many times. The shadow of barbed wire lies across a condemned playground of memories. Those who were caught by the great illusion over time and have lived through its moral and intellectual debauch have either given themselves up to a new addiction of the opposite type or are condemned to pay with a lifetime hangover. This need not be true of all ex-communists. Some may feel that their experience has been free from the morbid overtones described by Koestler. Nevertheless, Koestler has given here a truthful and honest characterization of the type of ex-communist to which he belongs. But it is difficult to square this self-portrait with the other claims of co-fraternity with which he speaks are the only people who know what it's all about. With equal right, a sufferer from traumatic shock might claim that he is the only one who really understands wounds and surgery. This is the most the intellectual anti-communist knows, or rather feels, in his own sickness, but he's ignorant of the nature of the external violence that's produced it, let alone the cure. The irrational emotionalism that dominates the evolution of many of the ex-communists. Quote, the logic of the opposition at all costs, says Salone, has carried many ex-communists far from their starting point, in some cases as far as fascism. I mean, see Mussolini. What were those starting points? Nearly every ex-communist broke with the party in the name of communism. Nearly everyone set out to defend the idea of socialism from the abuses of bureaucracy subservient to Moscow. Nearly every one of them began throwing out the dirty water of the Russian Revolution to protect the baby bathing in it. Sooner or later, these intentions are abandoned or forgotten. Or maybe people had childish notions to begin with. That's what I would say. Deutscher. Having broken with the party bureaucracy in the name of communism, the heretic goes on to break with communism itself. He claims to have made a discovery that the root of evil goes far deeper than he first imagined. Oh my God, have I seen this many times? Even though his digging for that root may have been very lazy and shallow. Cough, cough. Have I seen this very many times too? He no longer defends socialism from unscrupulous abuse. He now defends mankind from the fallacy of socialism. He no longer throws out the dirty water of the Russian Revolution to protect the baby. He discovers that the baby is a monster and must be strangled. The heretic becomes a renegade. I mean, I think you can see this in real time if you've ever read Les Kolakowski's The Main Currents of Marxism, where he starts off as a Marxist when he writes it, when he writes the beginning of it, and is like a diehard anti-Marxist by the end. You can literally watch him strangle the baby after he tries to drown it in the bathwater. How far he departed from his starting point, whether, as Salone says, he becomes a fascist or not, depends on his inclination and taste. And the stupid Stalinist Hellenist heresy hunting often drives the ex-communists to the extremes. I will say this, I do get to ignore it. I actually get really mad when people will be like yelling at me, for example, about the Popular Front when they don't know that that's actually a Comintern doctrine that I'm rejecting. And they're like, the Popular Front, that sounds like Trotsky stuff. And I'm like, it's the opposite of that, friend. Because the people yelling at me don't even know enough about their own ideological tradition to like get their fucking what they're yelling about right. They don't care. It's all vibes, right? But anyway. But those kind of people become ex-communists or become hybrid communist reactionaries, are people who will try to claim that Stalin and Hitler are really on the same page, which is, you know, the worst forms of National Bolshevism, etc. It's all gross. And I don't like just calling things gross. That's not an intellectual argument, but it is gross in the sense that it's a betrayal of even self-honesty to preserve your sense of ego. All right, but anyway, back to this. But whatever the shades of the individual attitudes, as a rule, the intellectual ex-communist ceases to oppose capitalism. Bingo. He often rallies to its defense, and he brings to this job the lack of scruple, the narrow-mindedness, the disregard for truth, the intense hatred with which Stalinism has imbued him, or what he thinks Stalinism imbued him with. A lot of these people just invert what they think Stalinism was and do it, but for capitalism. It's quite disgusting. He remains a sectarian. He is an inverted Stalinist. Oh, Deutscher, if you could slightly get over your Stalinism is the only sin thing. There's a lot of ugly things to reconcile in what happened in the Soviet Union, particularly around the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the purges. The Azovchina is, to me, unjustifiable. But it's hardly the worst thing that's ever happened. And people are like, oh, Stalin killed more people than... It depends on how you count. And I'm not saying this to defend Stalin. Stalin killed many, many people unnecessarily. But who gets counted for what and what is considered intentional for what is always kind of at odds. Anyway. Let's just put it this way. A lot of people were killed during the Azovchina that didn't need to happen. And we'll leave it at that. He continues to see the world in black and white, but now the colors are differently distributed. As a communist, he saw no difference between the fascists and the social democrats. As the anti-communist, he sees no difference between Nazism and communism. We see a lot of this. And a lot of deliberate confusion with people calling people fascists who aren't, so that they can muddy the waters. This is a long-held tactic, friends. It's not new. Once he accepted the party's claim to infallibility, now he believes himself to be infallible. Having once been caught by the great illusion, he is now obsessed by the greatest disillusionment of our time. His former illusion is at least in pride a positive ideal. His disillusionment is utterly negative. His role is therefore intellectually and politically barren. In this, too, he resembles the embittered ex-Jacobin of the Napoleonic era. Wordsworth and Coleridge were fatally obsessed with the Jacobin danger. Their fear dimmed even their poetic genius. It was Coleridge who denounced in the House of Commons a bill for the prevention of cruelty to animals as the strongest instance of legislative Jacobism. Man, that dumb shit has a 300-year pedigree. Anyway, the ex-Jacobin becomes the prompter of the anti-Jacobin reaction in England. Directly or indirectly, his influence was behind the bill against seditious writing and traitorous correspondence, or the Treasonable Practices Bill and the Seditious Meanings Bill, 1792 to 94, the defeats of the parliamentary reforms, the suspension of the habeas corpus act, the postponement of the emancipation of England's religious minorities for a lifetime of a generation, since the conflict with revolutionary France was, quote, not a time to make hazardous experiments, the slave trade, too, obtained a lease on life in the name of liberty. And when people want to forget that Britain was not great on the slave trade, even though it was better than the United States, kind of, after the United States left, you need to remind yourself of that. In quite the same way our ex-communist, for the best of reasons, does the most vicious things, he advances bravely in the front rank of every witch hunt. His blind hatred of his former ideas leavened to the contemporary conservatism. Not rarely he denounces even the mildest brand of the welfare state as legislative Bolshevism. He contributes heavily to the moral climate in which the modern counterpart of the English anti-Jacobin reaction is hatched. His grotesque performance reflects the impasse in which he finds himself. The impasse is not merely his. It is the part of a blind alley in which his entire generation leads an incoherent and absent-minded life. The historical parallel drawn here extends to the wider background of the two epochs. The world split between Stalinism and anti-Stalinist alliance in much the same way as the world split between Napoleonic France and the Holy Alliance. It is split between degenerated revolution exploited by a despot and a grouping of predominantly, although not exclusively, conservative interests. In terms of political politics, the choice seems to be now, as it was then, confined to those alternatives. And yet the rights and wrong of this controversy are so hopelessly confused that whichever the choice and whichever its practical motives, it is almost certain to be wrong in the long run in the broadest historical sense. And that line right there is kind of why I'm reading this essay to you. An honest and crucially minded man could reconcile himself to Napoleon as little as he can now to Stalin. But despite Napoleon's violence and fraud, the measures of the French Revolution survived to echo powerfully throughout the 19th century. The Holy Alliance freed Europe from Napoleon's oppression, and for a moment its victory hailed by most Europeans, yet it was Castlereagh and Metternich and Alexander I, who had to offer the liberated Europe, was merely the preservation of the old decomposing order. Thus, the abuses and aggressiveness of an empire bred by revolution gave a new lease on life to European feudalism. This was the ex-Jacobin's most unexpected triumph, but the price he paid for it was precisely himself, in his anti-Jacobin case, looked like a vicious, ridiculous anachronism. In the year of Napoleon's defeat, Shelley wrote to Wordsworth, "In honored poverty thy voice did reave, songs consecrated to truth and liberty. Deserting these thou leavest me to grieve, thus having been that thou shouldst cease to be." If our ex-communists have any historical sense, he would ponder this lesson, but most didn't, and they don't now either. Some of the ex-Jacobin prompters of the anti-Jacobin reaction had as few scruples about their volte-face as Burnhams and the Ruth Fishers of our day. Others were remorseful, pleaded patriotic sentiment, or philosophy of the lesser evil, or both, to explain why they had sided with the old dynasties against the upstart emperor. If they did not deny the vices of the courts and the governments they had once denounced, they claimed that those governments were more liberal than Napoleon. This was certainly true of Pitt's government, even though in the long run the social and political influence of Napoleonic France on Europe's civilization was more permanent and fruitful than that of Pitt's England, not to speak of the influence of Metternich's Austria, of Alexander's Russia. "O grieve, the earth's best hopes rest all in thee," was the sigh of resignation which Wordsworth reconciled himself to Pitt's England. "Far, far more abject is thine enemy," was the formula of reconciliation. "Far, far more abject is thy enemy" might have been the text of The God That Failed, or for the philosophy of the lesser evil expounded in its pages, the author for which the writers of the book defend the West against Russia, and communism is sometimes chilled by the uncertainty of residual ideological inhibition. The uncertainty appears to be the lines of their confessions, are incurious asides. Sloane, for instance, still describes the pre-Mussolini Italy against which, as a communist, he rebelled as pseudo-democratic. He hardly believes that post-Mussolini Italy is any better, but he sees its Stalinist enemy to be far, far more abject. More than the other co-authors of the book, Sloane is surely aware that the price of the Europeans of his generation have already paid for the acceptance of lesser evil philosophies. Louis Fisher advocates the double rejection of communism and capitalism, but his rejection of the latter sounds like a feeble saving face formula, and his newly found cult of Gandhiism impresses one as merely an awkward escapism, although it was super influential on the new left. Anyway, in America. But it was Koestler who occasionally, in the midst of all his affection and anti-communist fringery, reveals a curious mental reservation. Quote, "If we survey history," he says, "and compare the lofty aims in the name of which revolutions were started and the sorry ends of which they came, we see again and again how polluted civilization pollutes its own revolutionary offspring." My italics. Had Koestler thought out the implications of his own words, or is he merely throwing out a bon mot? If the revolutionary offspring, communism, have really been polluted by the civilization against what it rebels, then no matter how repulsive that offspring may be, the source of the evil is not but in that civilization. And this will be so regardless of how seriously Koestler himself may act as an advocate of the defenders of civilization a la Chambers. That's Whittaker Chambers. Even more startlingly is another thought, or perhaps only a bon mot, to which Koestler unexpectedly ends his confession. "I served Communist Party for 7 years, the length of which, as Jacob tended to Laban's sheep to win Rachel, his daughter. When the time was up, the bride had led into the dark tent. Only the next morning did he discover in his eyes he had not spent not only on the lovely Rachel, but also on the ugly Leah. I wonder whether he ever recovered from the shock of having slept with an illusion. I wonder whether afterwards he had ever believed in it. I wonder whether the happy end of the legend will be repeated, for at the price of another 7 years of labor, Jacob was given Rachel too, and the illusion became flesh, and the 7 years seemed unto him but a few days, for the love he had for her." One might think that Jacob Koestler reflects uneasily whether or not he too hastily ceased tending Laban's stolen sheep instead of waiting patiently until the illusion became flesh. The words are not meant to blame, let alone castigate anybody. Their purpose, let this be repeated, is thrown into relief a confusion of ideas, from which the ex-communist intellectual is not the only sufferer. In one of his recent articles, Koestler vented his irritation at those good old liberals who were shocked by the excesses of the anti-communist zeal in their former communist, and viewed him with disgust with which ordinary people look at a defrocked priest taking a girl out to the dance. Well, the good old liberals might be right after all. This particular type of anti-communist may appear to them like a defrocked priest taking out not just a girl, but a harlot. The ex-communist utter confusion of the intellect and emotion makes him ill-suited for any political activity. He is haunted by a vague sense that he has betrayed either his former ideals or the ideas of bourgeois society. Like Koestler, he may even be an ambivalent notion that he has betrayed both. He then tries to suppress his sense of guilt and uncertainty, or to camouflage it by a show of extraordinary certitude and frantic aggressiveness. Oh my God, if these people have critter, oh my God, they do, and we see them all the time. Thank you, James Lindsay. He insists that the world should recognize his uneven conscience as the clearest conscience of all. He may no longer be concerned with any except one, self-justification. And this is the most dangerous motive for any political activity, which I agree with Deutscher here. It seems to me the only dignified attitude the intellectual ex-communist can take is to rise au douce de mêlée. He cannot join the Stalinist camp or the anti-Stalinist Holy Alliance without doing violence to his better self. So let him stay outside any camp. Let him try to regain his critical sense and intellectual detachment. Let him overcome the cheap ambition to have a finger in a political pie. Let him be at peace with his own self, at least, if the price has to be to pay for the phony peace with the world is self-renunciation and self-denunciation. This is not to say that the ex-communist man of letters or the intellectual at large should retire into the ivory tower. His contempt for the ivory tower lingers in him from his past. But he may withdraw into a watchtower instead, to watch with detachment and alertness this heaving chaos of the world, to be a sharp lookout for what is going on to emerge from it, and to interpret it sine ira et studio. This is now the only honorable service the ex-communist intellectual can render to a generation with scrupulous observation and honest interpretation that has become so sadly rare. It's always rare, not becoming rare. It is not striking how little observation and interpretation and how much philosophizing and sermonizing one finds in the books of gifted pleiads of ex-communist writers. But can the intellectual really now be detached observer of the world? Even if he takes sides that makes him identify himself with causes that, in truth, are not his, must he not take sides all the same? Well, we can recall some great intellectuals who, in similar situations in the past, refused to identify with any established cause. Their attitude seemed incomprehensible to many of their contemporaries, but history has proved their judgment to have been superior to the phobias and hatreds of their age. 3 names may be mentioned here: Jefferson, Goethe, and Shelley. All 3, in each in different ways, were confronted with the choice between the Napoleonic idea and the Holy Alliance, and all 3, again, each in a different manner, refused to choose. Jefferson was the staunchest friend of the French Revolution in its early heroic period, even if ironically so, given his ownership of slaves. He was willing to forgive even the terror, but turned away in disgust with Napoleon's military despotism. Yet he had no truck with Bonaparte's enemies, Europe's hypocritical deliverers, as he called them. His attachment was not merely suited to diplomatic interests of a young and neutral republic. It was naturally from his Republican convention and democratic passion. Unlike Jefferson, Goethe lived right inside the storm center. Napoleon's troops and Alexander's soldiers in turn took up quarters in his Weimar. As the minister of his prince, Goethe opportunistically bowed to every invader. But as a thinker and a man, he remained noncommittal and aloof. He was aware of the grandeur of the French Revolution and was shocked by its horrors. He was greeted with the sound of the French guns at Valmy at the opening of the new and better epoch, and he saw through Napoleon's follies. He acclaimed the liberation of Germany from Napoleon, and he was acutely aware of the misery of that liberation. His aloofness and these, as in other matters, gained him the reputation of the Olympian, and the label was not always meant to be flattering. But his Olympian appearance was due at least of all to the inner indifference to the fate of his contemporaries. It veiled his drama, his incapacity and reluctance to identify himself with a cause, each inextricable tangle of right and wrong. Finally, Shelley watched the clash of 2 worlds with all the burning passion, anger, and hope of which his great young and soul was capable. He was surely no Olympian. Yet for a single moment did he accept the self-righteous claims and pretensions of any of the belligerents. Unlike the ex-Jacobins who were older than he was true to the Jacobin Republican idea. It was a Republican and not as a patriot of England of George III that he was greeted the fall of Napoleon, that most unambitious slave who did dance on the revel of the grave of liberty. But as a Republican, he also knew that virtue owes a mere tone of foe the Bonapartist force and fraud, old custom, legal crime, and bloody faith embodied in the Holy Alliance. All three, Jefferson, Goethe, and Shelley, were in a sense outsiders to the great conflicts of their time. And because of this, they were interpreted in their time with more truthfulness and penetration than did their fearful, their hate-ridden partisans on either side. What a pity and what a shame it is that the ex-communist intellectuals are inclined to follow the tradition of Woolworth and Coleridge rather than that of Goethe and Shelley. So Deutscher would ask these people to be quietist more than partisan hacks. Deutscher, though, I mean, the thing is, Jefferson himself was a Bonapartist figure. He betrayed a lot of his own ideals in his own presidency. Goethe, I think that is an accurate description of him. He was aloof, but he was a poet. He was a man of letters and a minister. Shelley dies a Republican, but he dies so young we don't have to see him betray himself. So even here, we don't know if Deutscher's gambit works. Deutscher wasn't an ex-communist. He was a Trotskyist. Believer in revolution his whole life, although a particular form of it. But the way Bonapartism looms over this essay is interesting, and the way so many people confuse their personal grievances, whether right or wrong, with an intellectual tradition really is the core problem here. Well, and on that note, I want you to think on it. I'm running out of voice, as you can hear. I'm very limited in what I could say. I'd like to thank all my sponsors. I'm going to name a few in the next video. A lot of you have been very helpful during this period of transition, and it's been a big period of transition. I've had to move. I've had to reestablish my equipment. I've had surgery. I have had to deal with some family job instability, and you guys have been there for me, and I really appreciate that. All right. Good night.